This is a new series where we're focusing on race in the field of international political economy, something we feel is desperately in need and we haven't paid enough attention to. So we're absolutely delighted that we have a year-long series of absolutely wonderful scholars who are going to help us learn more. More information about the series can be found at the Mortara website at Georgetown, mortara.georgetown.edu. For those that were unable to be with us for our last speaker, you can find the recording of that on our YouTube channel, and hopefully you'll find that information in our chat. GPEP is the Global Political Economy Project, which is based at Georgetown. Abe Newman and I are the co-directors of it, funded by the Open Society Foundation, where we're trying to reimagine the study of international political economy, focusing on the transformative effects of globalization on people's everyday lives. The foci that we are looking at are things like ecological sustainability, inequality, cultural identities, digital technologies, power dynamics in global networks, as well as new forms of authority beyond the nation state. So we're absolutely thrilled today to have Robbie Shillingman with us. He is a professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University and has built an extraordinary body of work around colonialism and race in the global order. His own work is a fascinating series of inquiries into the complex and truly transnational intertwining of race and politics across continents and diasporas. And I was fascinated to learn about his work this week that's not only just straightforward scholarship, but also deep community engagement as well. Things like curating exhibitions in the UK, Jamaica, and Ethiopia on the Rastafari movement and its political implications. He has a new book coming out, Decolonizing Politics, which he talks about as part of his commitment to building capacity in political science and IR for post-colonial teaching and learning. And so, you know, this is the exactly right venue to do that. We're so absolutely thrilled that you could take the time to join us today. Robbie's going to present for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to shift and have Abe Newman follow up with a few questions directly to him, and then we'll open up to audience Q&A. Please, throughout the presentation, you're welcome in the audience to use the Q&A function to ask questions, which Abe will be vetting and moderating throughout our time. So once again, Robbie, thank you so much for being here, and we're really excited to hear what you have to tell us. And unmuting, I think, would be the key thing. There you go.
That's it. I was trying, but someone was not allowing me for some reason. Thanks so much, Kate and Abe, for inviting me and for putting on this really interesting and important series. I've got a little 5-month-old baby down by my leg, so we'll see how he goes. But you might have to see some parenting and some sick, I'm afraid. But let's see how we go. Now, when the field of political economy thinks about its origin story, it tends to focus on the late 1700s, the shift to industrial production in Europe, and the rise of capitalism with all its social and political consequences. And political economists, if they look back towards a tradition of thought, then they'll usually focus in some way upon Scottish moral philosophy in the late 1700s, especially, for example, the work of Adam Smith and the subsequent responses by Ricardo, Mill, Marx, Engels, etc. Now, if you think about this late 18th century departure point for political economy, you'll have to think about stadial theories of progress, factories, the market as a balancer of interests and needs, the liberal reward of labour, or proletarianisation and class conflict, and you'll think predominantly of Europe. And yet some of the most prominent classical political economists, those Scots like Adam Ferguson, John Miller, James Stewart, Adam Smith, they all read avariciously about the Americas. They compared and contrasted the practice of indigenous peoples there with Europeans, past and present, in order to figure out how human nature worked upon and improved the wider natural world. They also compared and contrasted plantation slavery to European labor regimes, past and present, in order to justify the virtue of what they called commercial society, the Americas. Thinking of the Americas, well, that takes us to 1492, the late 15th century. And there, you'd have to imagine something quite different. Discovery and conquest across the Atlantic Ocean. You'd have to think about how imperial powers colonized indigenous peoples and of how humanity was divided into those whose faith enabled them to conquer and enslave and those whose idolatry allowed them to be conquered and enslaved. Is it possible to rethink the substance of political economy from 1492? And would that afford us a deeper optic on race? And I thought that's what I'd get us to think about in this seminar. I know it's not the first, it's the second one, but I guess we're early in the day in this series, and rather than present to you some kind of research program or some research topic, I thought I'd paint a world for us and then let us have a little chat about that world and think about how we might navigate it. So think about this as a preparation for the forthcoming talks in the series. And I want you to think with me in a creative fashion about the material I'm going to provide. I want you to help me think through how political economy might be conceived differently from a late 15th century instead of a late 18th century departure point, and how race might become integral to this conception. All right, so let's start with the meaning of discovery. Well, in Columbus's era, discovery did not necessarily refer to unknown land. Rather, to discover meant first and foremost to uncover land that was known to exist yet had remained hidden. And that might seem like a pedantic distinction to make, but it is a crucial one. The expansion of European Christendom across the world was conceived of as a divinely ordained event, not random. And it was directed by a shifting map of the world. Now, medieval Christendom had many different maps, but all of them were based upon geographical knowledge inherited from ancient Greek, Roman, and even Islamic scholars. Let me give you a little picture of one of them. Now, perhaps the most influential model was provided by the ancient Greek 5-zone map. And this map split the world into a sphere comprising of 2 frigid zones, the poles, 2 temperate zones between the tropics and the poles, those are the blue, and 1 torrid zone, the red, which is the tropics. Now, the frigid and the torrid zones were considered to be uninhabitable, while the northern temperate zone comprised the lands of Europe, Asia, and Africa known to the Greeks. Yeah. So not the whole of it, but those lands which were known to the Greeks. And these lands were divided between each other by either the Mediterranean or the Nile River, and they were encircled by a huge ocean river. Greek scholars also argued that celestial bodies affected the human body and influenced behavior. In other words, where you were geographically located beneath the stars and planets had an effect on your conduct. The cold regions, that part of the northern temperate zone which verged on the frigid zone, well, there it produced fierce yet unwise people. The hot regions of the temperate zone, which verged on the torrid zone, they produced wise yet tame people. Hold on, I'm just shifting my. It's all okay. All right. Okay. Abe, can you hear me? Can I just see your face? Can you hear me? Yeah.
No, you
can't. You can hear me. That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So the cold regions, people were fierce yet unwise. The hot regions, they were produced wise yet tame people. And it was only in the middle of the temperate zone where the Greeks lived basically, which produced a well-balanced people who were both wise and spirited and thus equipped with the characteristics to rule all other people. Medieval Christian scholars took the Greek map and laid it onto the biblical narrative. The division between temperate, cold, and hot nations was mapped roughly onto the sons of Noah, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And of especial importance is the prevailing association at the time with the word Ham with hot. Now add to this the infamous curse of Ham, which in Genesis chapter 9 placed Ham's descendants in servitude to the descendants of Shem and Japheth. And building from all these associations, Christian scholars typically cast the people who lived in the hot part of the temperate zone south of the Mediterranean on the African continent as natural slaves to those who lived in the temperate European zone north of the Med. So you can see the same ancient Greek idea of giving characteristics to people based on their geographical location was woven into biblical narrative by medieval Christianity. Let me give you another map. In fact, this cartographic reasoning justified the first reported abduction and enslavement of Africans at the Bay de Rio de Ora in northwestern Africa under the Portuguese flag in 1441. Actually, it was widely assumed that the habitable world ended just north of where the abduction occurred, specifically where Cape Bojador on the African mainland flanks the Canary Islands. And Portuguese sailors were usually loath to venture beyond this point into the torrid zone. Now, some scholars of the ancient world had claimed that any humans living in the torrid zone had to be unnatural, monstrous accidents deformed by nature's excessive heat. And many Christian scholars repeated this belief and attached it to the curse of Ham. Africans then appeared on the world map not only as natural slaves, but even possibly as subhuman monsters. By 1482, the Portuguese had established their first fort south of the Sahara at Elmina on the coast of current-day Ghana. Portuguese outposts relied on trade with local Africans, yet despite these very human relationships, the myth of monstrous people and natural slaves remained attached to the West African coastline and was still widespread when Columbus was planning for his journey. Crucially, these explorations did not happen in a geopolitical vacuum, but as part of a long period of expansionary warfare in defense of Christianity. Now, we call them the Crusades. In 1095, and in order to help raise Christian armies, Pope Urban II announced that those Europeans who had previously fought for private gain would have their sins remitted if they took up the fight against the expansionary Muslim dynasties which had taken control of Jerusalem. But there was also a reconquest in the West too. Beginning in the early 1700s, Christian forces had been involved in a centuries-long military struggle to take back the Iberian Peninsula, today Spain and Portugal, from the Islamic dynasties of the Moors. After 1095, this reconquest became framed as part of the Christian Holy War or Crusade against Islam. In fact, the Pope also urged those fighting Muslims in Iberia to stay there rather than travel east. And for that duty, he promised the same terms of remission of sin. Crucially, the reconquest featured a particular system of economic extraction that underwrote military campaigning on the Iberian Peninsula. And at the center of this system lay the encomienda, a grant from the Spanish crown to conquerors of the land that they had taken from Muslim or Jewish owners, and permission to extract labor and tribute from that defeated population. That was the encomienda, right? A grant from the Spanish crown to conquerors, to those who had conquered the lands which were being occupied, worked on by Muslims and Jews, and then a permission to even extract the labor and tribute of those defeated populations. So from the Crusades onwards then, it was deemed entirely right for Christians to conquer non-Christians, dispose them of their lands, and hold them in effective bondage. And crucially, even before 1492, the politics of reconquest was spilling south and west into the Atlantic world. While the Portuguese were busy making judgments about people living on the northwest African coastline, the attention of the Spanish fell upon the Canary Islands. The War of Castilian Succession, 1474 to 79, was fought in part due to the attempt by the King and Queen of Castile and Aragon, what was to become the Kingdom of Spain. It was fought in part by them to encroach upon the trade that the Portuguese king, Afonso V, enjoyed on the Atlantic African mainland coastline. The treaty ending the war in 1479 affirmed Portuguese influence over the African mainland and Spanish dominion over the Canary Islands. And that was perhaps the first treaty between European leaders to divide up lands outside of their Christian homelands. Here's the thing. The treaty was legally predicated upon two prior papal decrees issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452 and 1455, and both acknowledged the right of the Portuguese king to trade in enslaved Africans, giving him, in quotes from the bull, free and full permission to invade, search out, capture and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Now what's notable in this decree is the way in which the Crusades against Islam, that's the Saracens, right, were made to justify the enslavement of Ham's descendants, the Africans, regardless of whether they were Muslim or not. And just as crucially, the papal decrees that specifically concerned Spanish rule over the Canary Islands, they had something quite different to say about the treatment of the indigenous inhabitants there on the islands. So back in 1435, Pope Eugene IV decreed that natives of the Canary Islands who were converting to Christianity or had converted must not be enslaved. And this decree was reaffirmed with the Treaty of 1479, which gave the islands to the Spanish. So why the different treatment between mainland Africans and island Africans? Here's the thing. The indigenous peoples of the Canary Islands complicated the principles of holy war primarily because their presence did not fit neatly into Christian cartography. Remember, most of the other Atlantic islands, the Azores, Madeiras, etc., were discovered uninhabited, but the Canaries were discovered inhabited. Well, the islands existed on the very border of the torrid zones just above Cape Bojador. But unlike the mainland, these islands were not mentioned in biblical genealogies. So even if they were southern peoples from a hot clime, they could still not be regarded as the descendants of Ham, who had a prominent place in the genealogy of the Old Testament, supposedly as the rightful slaves of Japhet. What's more, nor could these indigenous peoples be conflated with the enemies of Christ, Jews and Muslims. After all, these indigenous peoples had not rejected the gospel. They hadn't even been exposed to it. They weren't even in the Bible. So, while Canary Islanders, as southern heathens, might be said to naturally come under the domination of European Christendom, they could not be treated as natural slaves, as the sons of Ham. And as spiritual innocents, they could only be dominated through the process of peaceful conversion to the Christian faith. And actually, as hot nations, the inhabitants could be considered wise and tameable. That was even back from the ancient Greeks, right? So capable of peaceful conversion to Christianity. Well, that was the reasoning in Rome. But the Spanish crown had to contend with the practicalities of colonizing the Canary Islands, and that in part undermined the papacy's lofty position. Now, as they pushed forward their conquest of the Canary Islands, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish monarchs, also began the final push to reconquer the Iberian mainland, warring with the last Islamic polity, the Emirate of Granada, between 1482 and 1491. And note that Granada is considered conquered in 1492. There's Granada. Now, during that time, Pope Sixtus IV diverted tithing revenue, and tithing revenue is taxes that Christians gave to the church. The Pope diverted those revenues to the Spanish monarchs so that they could finance the Holy War. And the Pope gave the same right to the monarchs when it came to the Canary Islands. So on the one hand, peaceful conversion was key to a successful conquest for the Spanish monarchs, both religiously and economically. Once converted, these indigenous peoples would become taxpayers to the crown. But on the other hand, the monarchs weren't the ones doing the actual conquering. They entrusted this dirty work to mercenaries, hired hands, whose sins were being remitted by the church. And yet, paradoxically, mercenaries would likely be locked out of any revenue streams once the indigenous peoples converted peacefully to Christianity. Then all those tithes and those revenue streams would go to the crown, not to the mercenaries. And that's why, despite papal decrees and the like, conquistadors pursued the final conquest of the Canary Islands with the same method as those who conquered Granada. It didn't matter if the people were guilty infidels or innocent heathens. In both cases, lands were taken by brute force and peoples often placed into bondage. Now, what does all this mean? Well, that by the time that Columbus was planning to set sail, the conquest of the Canary Islands had already presented a set of deep challenges to the Christian mapping out of the world. Specific questions arose, such as, what did the location of the natives say about their characteristics? How did these natives fit into a holy war of conquest when they weren't even mentioned in the Bible? And how could religious, political, and economic interests be reconciled so as to peacefully incorporate these natives into the church and empires of European Christendom? Such conundrums and questions were ultimately resolved by brute force. These questions and their violent resolutions would travel with Columbus to be incredibly amplified in a set of islands on the other side of the Atlantic. April 1492, Columbus met with Ferdinand and Isabella to petition support for his voyage. Columbus's opponents charged him with heresy. Primarily, they drew upon the authority of Saint Augustine of Hippo, who had believed that the geographical dispersal of humanity after the biblical flood was delimited to the known world, that is, the known and habitable masses of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Now, firstly, Columbus disputed the assertion that the tropics were uninhabitable because they were torrid. So he went against the whole map. And he had himself experienced the fact that the tropics were habitable in a 1482 visit to the Portuguese fort at Elmina in present-day Ghana, one of the most famous kind of slave forts in history. Not only did Columbus note the rich trade in enslaved humans, gold, ivory, and pepper, but he also reported that the area was densely populated and, to a good extent, temperate. Secondly, Marco Polo's travels east had suggested against St. Augustine that humanity was scattered far wider than the church had presumed. And influenced by Marco Polo's mention of the most easterly islands, that is Japan, Columbus believed that these Indies stretched from the temperate zone down into the tropics and that they could be approached as such by crossing the Atlantic. Now, Columbus responded to his detractors by mapping this journey of discovery onto the apocalyptic calendar of Christianity. Remember, his detractors said he's heretical. He's going against the church. Columbus says, no, I'm not. I'm with the church. Now, in theological terms, apocalypse doesn't mean the cataclysmic end of the world, but it means the final revelation of divine mystery. The biblical book of Revelation sets out a cryptic narrative detailing the rise of an antichrist before the final return of the Messiah. And like many others, Columbus considered the liberation of Granada and the end of the Crusades in 1492 to be a sign that he was living in these apocalyptic times and that the Spanish monarchs were God's power on earth. So as an emissary to these monarchs, Columbus conceived of his venture as bringing into the fold the whole of scattered humanity for one final revelation. And that's why he ultimately believed that he had uncovered the Caribbean islands from their hiding place. Their discovery inaugurated a new spiritual dispensation for humanity, a new heaven on earth, or what we colloquially call today the New World. So anyway, his journey was doubly heretical. He wanted to uncover lands that were not mentioned in the Bible, and he wanted to do that in the tropics. Bringing what he called the Indios, the peoples of the Indies, into the Christian fold would fulfill the apocalypse and usher in heaven on earth. So, my little baby. So Columbus sailed not just west, but south and west. He began his voyage not off the coast of Portugal, but from the newly conquered Canary Islands. Columbus was certain of one thing at least. These peoples he would find in what would become known as the Caribbean Indies, as the West Indies, were heathens. Their existence wasn't even recorded in the Bible, and that meant that Columbus had full license to bring them into the fold of Christianity, which at this moment of apocalyptic time was protected by the Spanish monarchy. Still, because of the West and South commitment to uncovering humanity, the existing questions over the nature of the Canary Islands' native inhabitants traveled with Columbus to the Western Indies. Because just like the indigenous peoples of the Canary Islands, those across the Atlantic and the Indies could not be treated as if they were idolaters, as if they were Muslims, because they hadn't refused the word of Christ. They hadn't even heard of it before. And what's more, just like Canary Island natives, they couldn't be the children of Ham, as their geographical location lay outside of the Bible's map. Hence, they couldn't be treated as natural slaves either. Additionally, if the tropics could be temperate, if humans could live there without degenerating into unnatural monsters, then these natives across the Atlantic would have the characteristics of hot nations like the Canaries, people who lived in the hot part of the temperate zone, wise yet tameable, perfect converts. You don't believe me? Here's Columbus's words on how he described the first peoples he met in the Americas on the island of Guanahani in the present-day Bahamas. They should be good and intelligent servants, for I see that they say very quickly everything that is said to them, and I believe that they would become Christians very easily, for it seemed to me that they had no religion. Here's the thing. Just as had been the case in the Canary Islands, so in the Caribbean did demands by the Spanish crown for religious conversion clash with the demands by conquistadors for economic enrichment. After 1513, the Spanish crown presented a legal instrument to resolve this clash, the requirement, which was a declaration by the Spanish crown enunciated by conquistadors, which demanded that native Indios accept the conquistadors' domination, as well as the conquistadors' right to preach and convert. The declaration also warned that rejection of Christian rule and the consequences of it would be the fault of the Indios themselves. And this became the legal pathways by which conquistadors could easily treat native Indios as they had Canary Island natives. Their lands as spoils of holy war, as had been Muslim lands in Iberia, and or their bodies as bondage, as were the children of Ham. All you had to do was pronounce the requirement, Doesn't matter what the indigenous people say, when you say no, they didn't say yes, now we can conquer them. Now, in this way, the path was cleared for the expansion of the brutal encomienda system to take root in the Americas, and then ultimately what we call plantations. So the violence enacted in the Canary Islands, despite religious callings for peaceful conversions, was enacted in the New World and to a heretofore unimaginable extent. After just 150 years, only 10% of the indigenous populations remained across the Americas. Most were killed through war, land dispossession, and the diseases that took hold in the turbulence of colonization. Kidnapped Africans began arriving in Hispaniola in 1501. By mid-16th century had begun to replace indigenous peoples as the prime source of bonded labor. Between the 1680s and 1820s, approximately 90% of those who made the Atlantic crossing was Africans in shackles. So what's that got to do with race? Well, consider the origins of the term raza, la raza. That's the Romance kind of root of the term. 14th century meanings, in other words, 1300s, meanings include a coarseness in fine cloth, a defect in poetic speech. By 1492, La Raza predominantly refers to the breeding of purebred horses and the various religious lineages that makes humans human. Jews, Muslims, and heathens had degraded or sinful heredities compared to the Catholic who had been born into a Catholic family. No conversion. Race was all about purity of blood. And this purity was not just biological, but all at the same time and congenitally religious. And by the way, even today, phenotype, the root of pheno is to show, includes not just physiological attributes, but observed behavior too. Now, above all, this congenital nature of race heredity congealed around conquest and discovery, around dispossessed land and bonded labor, the fundamental stuff of capital accumulation, the stuff of political economy. And to be clear, I'm not talking about race as identity. I'm talking about race as an analytic. And then as an analytic, our departure point needs to be the late 15th century. And in this South Atlantic world, not the late 18th century and the North European world. So that's the space I'm opening up in this talk. So peeps, help me think through it in this conversation. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Robbie. So I have a bunch of questions, and I think we can just go in a stream of consciousness conversation for a few minutes and see where we go. And then we'll collect some questions that people are going to ask from the public, and then I'll pose those to you as well. So one of the things your story seems to me to highlight are the ways in which geography, religion, racial backgrounds, these social hierarchies are all overlapping in the way that power is being deployed over time. And what I've been thinking about these very same kind of ideas into the current way that we often talk about the transatlantic relationship. You're talking about this transatlantic, the 15, but there is, in my mind, when we talk about the West, the Western values, the civilizing project that is this often, in this transatlantic partnership, you hear those ambassadors talk. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about how these ideas that you're talking about from the early moments, how they're carried forward, but not often identified as connected to these, how do we mask these dynamics and then speak about them as if they're different or unconnected from this tradition. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, if the question I'm asking.
It does make sense.
How should we think about the transatlantic relationship today in light of this conversation that you're posing?
Yeah. I mean, let me give you a little story first, and then let me try and connect it a little bit more deeply, hopefully. So I don't know if you guys remember a few years ago, this white supremacist shot up these people in an AME church in the South, a guy called Dylan Roof, yeah? I think it was Dylan Roof. And pictures of him posing with his guns show that he had a badge, a flag as a badge on his lapel. And that flag was the flag of Rhodesia. It was the flag of Rhodesia after Ian Smith broke Rhodesia away from the British Commonwealth because there was an imminent decolonization, and Rhodesia was a settler society, predominantly black, but a minority white settler population ruled it on quasi-apartheid lines. And Ian Smith was famous for saying, we're breaking away from the British Empire because there's never in 1,000 years are we going to let black people run this thing. It's not going to be majority rule. Now, in the US in the 50s and 60s, when you had all these Brown versus Board of Education and all these desegregating moves, Rhodesia came to be seen as a fellow holdout of white rule. So the fate of the American South was often linked by various ideologues and politicians to the fate of Rhodesia. If Rhodesia went majority rule, then the South is going to desegregate, and civilization and white supremacy is lost, right? So even Dylan Roof a few years ago is parading that flag, right? And of course, there is this whole thing about transplanting the soil of the north of England, the good soil of England, into these corners all around the world, right? And making them a corner of England, right? There's very much, that is a very big thing to do with it. Even actually in the American Revolution, some of the cartoons, the political cartoons which accompanied the American Revolution in the 1760s, 1770s, depicted the what would become the white Americans, right? The colonists, the white colonists. They depicted themselves as indigenous princesses, and you would imagine, why would they doing that? Well, it's because the indigenous princesses had a claim to sovereignty based on the blood mixing with the soil. And the colonists didn't have that. So by presenting themselves as indigenous princesses, they were basically saying, we have transplanted our soil and our birthright from the good temperate zone of England into North America, right? So when we think about the transatlantic relationship, when we think even about the Anglosphere, which of course rarely includes India, which is a majority English-speaking country, but is majority non-white rule, right? When we think about these things, when you actually start to think about them, you start to see that the Anglo is a word which brings together race as claims to land, claims to heredity, claims to the wise pursuit of democracy, at least for some. Do you see what I mean? And claims to productivity and progress, i.e., God's dispensation on earth, right? And so this is the second thing I want to talk about, which is our understanding of race is very, very attenuated because we associate it with identity, or we associate it with physiology, right? And like I said, phenotype never meant physiology simply. It meant observed behavior as well as observed characteristics, both of those at the same time, right? Now, if that's the case, then we have to think very differently about race as an analytic. The usual story told today is that race, well, there might have been something about race before, but race really comes about in the late 19th century as part of eugenics, scientific racism, and then this is shared widely. This is, a science which is widely accepted, in North America, in Europe, and then of course the Nazis use it for the Shoah, and so therefore after 1945, we can never use race again, right? Which is why even most racists say I'm not a racist, right? I'm just talking about what? I'm just talking about their culture. Now, of course, what I'm saying is race initially when it became embedded, integral to a project of discovery, conquest, expansion, dispossession, and enslavement, right? Race back then in the 1500s meant purity of blood. And purity of blood was all about which religion flowed through your bloodlines. So even at this origin, if you like, there is both a biology and a culture there. And it's actually, it makes no sense to take those two things apart. So when we talk about saying race as the organizing principle of political economy, right, of hierarchies, excisions, of oppression, of dispossession, of capital accumulation, then we're not talking about identities. We're not talking about the whites did this to the blacks, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about the most deepest justifications and classifications which are necessary for this whole project of capital accumulation to proceed.
Awesome. Okay, so can I just push you on that last comment about thinking about how should we think about race as an organizing principle of international relations, and particularly in this economic sphere as capitalism, the global capitalist project. And I have been thinking a lot about questions of integration or disintegration, if you think about Brexit, or questions about global spanning supply chains with China and with partners in other countries. And I know that what you just said should be changing the way I view these questions. And so I'm just wondering if you could, apply what you just said to some of these. You've even written on Brexit, like these kinds of questions. But I just wonder how you see our thinking should be altered on these kinds of questions of integration, disintegration, openness, closeness, the power that's exerted over economic relations with other social groups. Just expand on that for a little bit.
So, I mean, I think the first thing to say on that is that there are particular economic, it's not the case that in every single question of political economy that you need to go back to 1492, right? So that to me is a given, and that's not the analytic that I'm talking about. Do you see what I mean? The kind of descriptive or the technical way in which financial markets work and all that. That is one thing, right? But the deeper social and political impact of them and their organizing principles, that then is an analytic of race. And what you find is that there is always capital accumulation is always organized around heredity, right? And heredity is always racialized. And because it's racialized as heredity, it's always gendered as well, right? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. In other words, for example, who is deserving or undeserving of welfare, right? Now that deserving or undeserving might seem like a moral argument, right? But that deserving and undeserving is always implicated in group characterizations of whole groups, right? And those shift. So, for example, up until 2012 or 2016, most people, when they were talking about who was deserving of welfare or not, at least in the Western world, said, well, these white underclass, they've let us down. They don't actually have the characteristics and the dispositions which are required to be successful in this capitalist world. They're not prudent, they're idle, they're not industrious, they don't save their money, they're feckless, all that kind of stuff, right? However, they're always seen as as those kind of relatives who have let the side down. You see what I mean? Now, when you look now, who is perceived as the left behind? It's not black people, it's not Muslim people, it's not Hispanics, it's the white the white working class. Do you see what I mean? So so in these inclusions, there are hierarchies within these inclusions, right? But then these inclusive hierarchies are always predicated upon bigger excisions and exclusions. I don't know if that makes sense. And of course, refugees, illegal migration, in quotes, all that kind of stuff factors into play. So I would think about this in terms of heredity. Who is deemed to be worthy to be included in the club, right? Worthy to accumulate capital and benefit from the accumulation of capital, to pass that on, right? And who has that taken from them, right? Who has that taken from them? Think about the financial crisis, 2008, and disproportionately, black peoples in the US had their properties taken from them because they've been given bullshit. Sorry to swear. Mortgages in the first place, right? So this is the way that I would see that, Abe, and I would see it as an analytic, which doesn't necessarily mean that every single moment of operation that we're doing political economy, you need to draw that in. But if you're talking about the deeper political and historical questions about shifts in power, then that's where I say you need to think about it.
Yes, I mean, just to underscore that, I think the dominant models in international political economy, they're really drawing on neoclassical interpretations of how markets work, which is all this atomized individual. Individuals are rational actors, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
blah, blah. And that immediately erases the conversation that you've just presented. Right. And that's why I think it's so important the way you started and say, well, there's the Scottish Enlightenment, but everybody forgets about this other thing because everybody just wants to kind of start from invisible hand, we're all these rational actors, and then you get markets devoid of social hierarchies. And so I think we have to go back
absolutely
to this,
and in fact go back to those late 17th 18th century people. Go back to Adam Smith. You tell me if he talks about rational individuals. Those guys are talking about heads of households. They're talking about paterfamilias.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And those who have the right to inherit property, right? Yes. And then of course that is a hereditary thing, which is a race thing as well. Which groups are not, which groups are feckless enough that they never figured out how to actually pass on property to their own family.
Okay, we have several questions from the audience. So I'm going to pose these, and then maybe you can answer them, as you see fit. So the first one is from Kinti Orellana, and they ask, to what extent do you think the hierarchical views of the supposed superiority of the Greeks constituted a particular way to see the world that has been transplanted to the dynamics of generations of knowledge, not only to that world? We have another question of how essential was the papacy to the imperialistic ventures that you describe? That was from Richard Lycan. And then a comment from Van Nugen, which is one of your comments was talking about mapping as an example of eugenics, in which it was used to justify the abduction of enslaved people from Africa because they were either wise or tame and thus easier to be conquered. Can you talk more about current day mapping and specifically from the period of slavery onward, and how it reproduces this type of project of capital accumulation? So 3 really big questions. Unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes left, so I want to put them all on the table. I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so the first question is a really important question, and I'm hesitating because there's a number of quite subtle things to say about that, right? We don't live in the world of the ancient Greeks, right? That's for sure. But to my mind, there are very deeply entrenched ways of thinking about and living in the world which continue even when other things change. And even if they themselves are remixed, they still tend to keep the same kind of constellation. right? So there's stuff to say about people like Aristotle, who actually he didn't think people were intrinsically idle or fierce or timid if they lived in a place, but he thought that the environment tended to make them that way, right? And then, of course, when you get to someone like Immanuel Kant, Kant is very much saying, you know, these people, you must see them like this, and it doesn't matter if they travel the ocean and start to live in a temperate climate, they still have the same characteristics which are conducive of a natural slave, right? So to my mind, I kind of want to see, like, you know, the stars might shift, but some of the lodestars in the constellation don't, right? And I know that's a challenging thing to think about, but it's also challenging because we have very attenuated ideas about where we start our thinking about the modern world. And that's one of the things I was trying to say. If we think our thinking about the modern world begins with industrialization or begins with scientific racism, right? Then no, I'm sorry, that's just simply not the case. And we might need to think about why we have been told that, right? So I think that's one of the things that I would say about that first point. That links to the map thing, in the sense that so there's a very, very famous guy called Charles Booth who did one of the very first mapping out of poverty, right, in a city. It was in London in the late 1800s, and very much he was the guy who kind of created the idea of the urban survey. But his mapping out of London was incredibly influential for almost all of the mapping out of poverties in the 20th century, especially in urban spaces. Here's what he did. He made his unit of analysis the street. And he went round to all the families and he tried to get knowledge of every family in a street. He tried to get knowledge from school boards and all these kind of things about what kind of people lived there, right? But he never was able to get knowledge of every street. But what he did was he said, this street is in proximity to this street, or these people at the end of this street are in proximity to those people at the end of the other street. Therefore, I will count them as the same unit. So what you start to see is a mapping out of poverty wherein it's not the individuals which are being canvassed, but they are guilty, if you like, by virtue of living in a particular space. And that space is given attributes. So in the late 19th century, Charles Booth is part of a whole discourse which says that the East End of London are like the wilds. They're like the dens. It's like our own undiscovered African continent, the dark, right? That's how these places in East London are being perceived. So even when we're talking about a more scientific way of thinking about poverty and mapping out poverty, what you almost always get is a conflation of the characteristics of the space to the characteristics of the people and the causal reasons as to why they might be poor. And one gets this in a lot of the, you know, ongoing, for example, turning over of lands into plantations, especially in Southeast Asia at the moment. You know, are these lands idle? Are they mosquito plagued? Are they swamps? Are they unproductive? Well, guess what? The people who live there are too. And then when we turn it over into a productive plantation, they might become industrious. But if they don't, it's because they could never extricate themselves from their condition before. So the mapping thing is really, really important, right? Mapping is always about telling a story. Even if it's scientific as you want to get, it's about telling a story, and it's about giving attributes to space and necessarily then infecting those people in that space with those attributes. I can't remember what the other question was, Abe. It was a question about the papacy. Yeah. So what on the one hand, the papacy are kind of like, the popes are just trying to keep control, and of course, you know, with this, what Spain becomes the first kind of, you know, real global empire. and the Spanish monarchs do what the Spanish monarchs kind of want, right? So in a way, the papacy is kind of like just fighting a losing battle. But what's much more important to my mind, and I know this is a challenge to think about, is to think that you cannot analytically distinguish faith from economics. That's my point, right? That these are integral. So the whole creation of this massive enterprise of coming into lands, dispossessing people of the lands, turning them into plantations, turning those people in those lands either into bonded labor, or when they or put them marginal somewhere, or when they run out, import other bodies of labor, right? That from the 1600s, from the 1630s onwards, is probably the principal mode of production in the world. It far outstrips industry, right, in terms of its actual impact on the world, right? And it's mega now too. All of that is, when you analyze it, what makes it, it's impossible to detract the religion and the faith from the economic interest. And of course, political economy was all built upon a conceit that something called interest was different to something called desire. You get what I'm saying? And that you could have a virtue which was based on the fact that your self-interest, when combined with other self-interests, nicely worked itself out for the good of the whole. That was the whole conceit of political economy, right? But that conceit never got rid of the fact that these people were exercising desire, right? And that desire was all about conquering the world for your God. Many faiths and cosmologies around the world, even if they do the imperial thing and the conquering thing, you know one thing they don't do? They don't destroy other people's gods. Even the ancient Greeks before the Persian Wars, and then it all went different. But even the ancient Greeks, when they colonized around the Mediterranean, if there were other gods associated with those places, they either incorporated those gods into their pantheon, or they found a name for those gods which actually approximated what they were in their pantheon already. But going around the world and destroying other people's gods is the thing you have to do if you want to commit genocide. Right? So I would want us to think about political economy and the effect of the plantation system as unable to happen if we weren't in one way, shape or form thinking about destroying other people's gods.
Okay, Robbie, we have so many things in the chat, but we've run out of time.
Oh, sorry, man.
That's okay. Several of the comments are about very much this last point about how we think about the deservingness of the distributional consequences of capitalism. And last week we had a talk about trade politics and, you know, who are the winners and losers, and who is deserving to, you know, does it matter if certain people are losers? I just want to flag that because I think it's very related to what you were just saying. The other point, which we don't have time to discuss, but I want our readers or our listeners to go read. We have some recommended reading, and one of your pieces was a recent piece in the Review of International Political Economy, which I thought was very provocative in that it talks about how, you know, a core to the conversation about race is often coupled with abolition, that we should be getting rid of these power structures that are binding us in these different moments. But you make this point that those abolition projects are always about rebuilding. They're never just purely about banning. They're not bans. They're about creating new things. And I'm interested in what is, you know, the anti-racist or the abolitionist agenda for a global foreign policy. You know, like how should we be thinking of an international relations abolitionist agenda? Not just recognizing these power structures, but then also what are the institutions that need to be created to create an alternative? And so I'm going to call on our listeners to go read that piece. Help us come up with this.
No, I get you, Abe, and I would say, I mean, it might sound like I'm being a bit far out, but just try this thought experiment. think about a foreign policy which would not destroy other people's gods. Just think about what that would look like.
Yes.
You'll find it incredibly difficult.
Okay,
Maybe
on
you
that,
won't.
I know.
Maybe a genius is better than me.
So, Robbie, I just want to thank you again for joining us for the conversation. I want to encourage our listeners to go check out the recommended readings, get in touch with people on the seminar series. I think there's a lot of thoughts are being generated, and we want to keep having this conversation. So once again, thank you. If people didn't get to see the last talk, it's on our website. There's a video. This one will be posted soon. So thanks again to Robbie for coming for a great conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. All right.
Bye.